Before we start, I just want to take a moment to share with you all. So Natalie mentioned I came in from Massachusetts. Actually, I was in Phoenix the past couple of days doing some work, and last night saw the horrific accident in DC. And then this morning learned, so our family, we're members of the Skating Club of Boston, and 6 members of our community were on that plane. So it's been a really challenging day for our family. My husband was a coach there, or is a coach there, and worked with the people whose lives were lost. But I will tell you this, I love law schools, and I love being with learners and students and a community of people interested in ideas. So I've been looking forward to this so much, and on a day like today, it's really a relief to be here with you, so thank you. Okay, so we are going to talk about money, politics, and the U.S. Constitution. And I'm going to spend some time doing some opening remarks, going through this slideshow, and then we'll hear from everybody else. But I really wanted to share this quote at the beginning. This is from Chief Judge Jeff Sutton of the Sixth Circuit. He's an incredible judge, but also a scholar, and he wrote a book recently, and the title is Who Decides? And he says here that everything in law and politics comes back to questions of power and the evergreen question, who decides? And that question, who decides, I'm going to keep coming back to throughout this, because that's really at the root of the work that we're doing at American Promise. So my remarks, first I'm going to talk a little bit about some fundamental principles that are kind of behind the constitutional amendment that we're working toward. Then I'll explain why this is what we consider to be a constitution-level issue. We'll talk about the proposed solution, which we call the For Our Freedom Amendment. And then I'll spend a little bit of time just reviewing. I mean, it's been a while since we've exercised our amendment muscles, so like, how do we do that? And is this even possible? So I hope that sounds like a good agenda. And I would also welcome people at any point, like raise your hand if you have a question as we go along. But first, I like to start with popular sovereignty and representative self-government, because when you think about the issue of money in politics and the influence of money in politics, there's lots of reasons why people may care about it, but I think at the root, it's because it connects to this idea of popular sovereignty and who actually rules. And when I go back in history and I look at the founding moment and the Declaration and the debates that led up to the Constitution, I think that popular sovereignty and debates about what does it mean for the people to be sovereign? How do you implement the idea of the people being sovereign? This was like a really key thing that the founders were struggling with and trying to make real in various ways through the Constitution that they designed. And so, you know, I would argue, and I have in a recent paper, that there's multiple ways that our Constitution tries to implement the idea of popular sovereignty, ruled by the people. But one of the most crucial devices to implement popular sovereignty is what Madison called the scheme of representation, right? We're going to elect people to represent us. And at its core, representation is supposed to be a relationship, right? You have your elected official and you have your constituents. And in the United States, constituencies are typically organized geographically. And that relationship is supposed to be one where the representative is capable of connecting with the constituents, understanding their concerns and priorities, and then somehow translating that into the decisions that he or she is making as a policymaker. And this is just some simplified ways of thinking about this, but if you just sort of at a high level think about who's part of a constituency, there's like everyday, ordinary Americans living in a town or a city, and then there's the business leaders and the civic associations and churches and local leaders, school board members, mayors, all that. And then in most constituencies, there's also a small number of people today who participate in the political process as donors, right? People that contribute to political campaigns and are contributing perhaps to the campaigns of the people that are running to represent them. But they, in general, are a small number of people. Now, the next slide is going to be sort of a snapshot of the ecosystem that we live with now, but then we're going to unpack a little bit how we got there. So we now have an ecosystem where beyond just constituents and the relationship between constituents and their representative, there are other actors. They could be, I'm going to pick on Natalie. So let's say Natalie decides to run for office here in Oklahoma City someday. People from Oklahoma City may contribute to her campaign, but maybe I, living in Boston, Massachusetts, decide that I want to contribute. In that case, I would be a non-constituent donor. Or maybe I really want Natalie to win, and so I form a pro-Natalie super PAC, and I put millions of dollars into that, millions of Massachusetts dollars, my Massachusetts dollars, into that super PAC to try to get her elected. So those are those independent expenditures that may also be coming from outside of the constituency. Now, I'm saying this not to pass judgment on any of this, but just to paint a picture of the reality of the ecosystem that we have. So in recent years, the Supreme Court has had a number of cases going back, honestly, to 49 years ago today. January 30th, 1976 was when Buckley versus Vallejo was decided. But over the past 5 decades, they've basically come to the conclusion that there are very limited circumstances under which policymakers can try to set limits on money in politics. And they've also said that an interest or concern about influence and access, ingratiation, that is not a sufficiently compelling governmental interest to justify limits on money in politics. So that's their view. And that is one of the reasons why the ecosystem pictured here is the one that we have. So why is this a constitution level problem? Okay, so we're going to go back to this question again. Who gets to decide whether and how to regulate money in our campaigns and elections? Now, for big questions of allocation of power, a place where you may look for an answer is the Constitution. And one of the places that quite obviously talks about elections is Article 1, Section 4, mainly about federal elections. And it basically says that state legislatures have the main or the initial role in setting rules for federal elections, and then Congress has a role in altering such regulations if it sees fit. I'm obviously summarizing at a high level. Obviously, it doesn't say anything about state elections, because I think the assumption at the time was that state elections, the decision would be made by the states. And I think it's fair to say that for the first 200 years or so of American history, there hadn't been much thought by the Supreme Court of weighing into the decisions that states may make about how to structure their electoral system, especially when it comes to the influence of money. But in 1976, I point to this as the real shift. And this was where, in a real full-throated way, the Supreme Court basically said, we think that the First Amendment is implicated by questions of money in politics. And let me just say, I agree. I think the freedom of speech is very much implicated by whether and how to regulate money in politics. But what happened was that because in the mid-1970s, we were also happening to live in a moment in time where the courts had basically become the main and only ones to say what the freedom of speech means, they basically, in effect, took the whole area of campaign finance into the judiciary. And because everything started to get filtered through as a First Amendment question, which the Supreme Court got to be the ultimate one to call the shots about what that meant. Now, I like to just call out this quote from Buckley versus Vallejo because I think what's interesting is they had, I think, a good faith empirical assumption, which was that they were wary of people setting limits on money in politics because they thought it could interfere with the informational environment and actually degrade it or make it less rich. So they sort of thought less money might actually mean less expression, less spreading of ideas, fewer voices in the mix. And I will suggest later that just as a matter of fact, more money has not actually necessarily meant more ideas, deeper exploration, or more voices. And in fact, in some cases, it has meant to fewer voices, fewer issues, very loud, and at a superficial level of exploration, but just you can't escape it. So I think that their hypothesis about how this might play out was somewhat mistaken. I'm not going to get into all the details here on this slide, and there's more cases. I just picked a few to make the broader point that what has happened since Buckley versus Vallejo is that in a series of cases, the court has weighed in and basically taken certain policy options completely off the table from lawmakers. So, for example, Montana passed some anti-corruption laws in the early 1900s to try to stem the influence of outside money in their state elections, and that law was struck down by the Supreme Court after Citizens United. Another example, I'll just tell you, like last year, the Texas Republican GOP party platform has a plank in it that says, hey, we want unlimited contributions to candidates. We don't want any cap on contributions, but we don't want any out of Texas money going to candidates. They know that if they tried to pass a law like that, it would be struck down by a court, because that's also an option that has been taken off the table. And other states have done other things, and I can give more examples later. But the main point is that the question of who decides has been taken away from policymakers, because at the end of the day, right now, it's the courts that decide. So you may know that your governor formed a task force, I think in 2023, and it issued a report in 2024. And I just wanted to highlight a quote here where they say, despite the wishes of many in Oklahoma, the U.S. Supreme Court has spoken, and independent expenditures, think of things like super PACs, et cetera, are constitutional in the United States. Oklahoma does not have a mechanism to reverse the long line of Supreme Court precedent, nor can we simply ignore it. Again, who decides? What they're saying here is the court has decided, and of course we have to follow it. I don't quibble with that at all. And then, last thing, I just wanted to point out again a sort of empirical hypothesis that the court made in 2010 as part of its Citizens United decision, where they said, legislatures might be worried about the appearance of influence and access, but the appearance of influence or access will not cause the electorate to lose faith in our democracy. And do not misunderstand me to be saying that there's a perfect one-to-one relationship between money and politics and faith in democracy, because I couldn't say that. But I will tell you, and you'll see, the American people on their own, like without being prompted, they will identify this as a main source of concern about whether their government actually represents their interests. So you will see this just shows sort of public trust in government, and it's been declining since really the post-World War II era. But with the exception of a brief 9/11 bump, it's been well below 50%, and now it's hovering at around 20% of trust, which is, again, without knowing exactly what the cause is, it is a matter of concern, I think, for Americans in terms of the stability of the system. when you talk to people, this one on the bubble graph, I think, is a little depressing because they just ask people to give like the first words that come to their head when they're asked about the political system, and not a single one of those top words was a positive one. And you'll see divisive and corrupt are very much up there. Americans feel that there's way too much time spent fighting in a partisan way, not enough time spent on the issues that matter to people. There's a wide perception that constituents have far too little influence when it comes to, and this is about members of Congress, but constituents have far too little influence, and large donors and lobbyists have outsized influence. And then the vast majority, over 70% of Americans, favor being able to limit spending in elections. Now, I'm going to be a broken record on this. So, our organization and the amendment that we champion is actually agnostic about what the policy should be. So we're not saying, oh, just because 70% of Americans think there should be limits, that there should be limits. Our whole point is who should decide? Who should decide whether and how to limit? And then the past 2 years, actually, Pew does a survey every year of Americans' top policy priorities. And again, they're not feeding people information, they're just asking them. In 2023, reducing the influence of money in politics was number 4. And in 2024, last year, it was number 3. And when you look in the crosstabs, what's so interesting is that there is no partisan difference among perception of this problem. So if you look at all those other priorities like strengthening the economy or concerns about immigration or terrorism, there's like a partisan split or imbalance. But on concerns about the role of money in politics, it's your left, your right, and everything in between. Okay, so who gets to decide? The proposed solution is a constitutional amendment whose purpose is to answer the question, who gets to decide? And to answer it in a way that says the states and Congress get to decide. So I forgot to bring them. We have napkins because the text of the amendment fits on a napkin. But before I get into it, though, let me just say one thing. So this language is language that we like to share. We want people to debate. We want people to talk about the ideas. We want Congress to give it a look and toss it around. But at the end of the day, proposal of an amendment by Congress is going to have to go through a whole process where the words and the language get argued about, and that's a good thing. So, nothing in this language is set in stone, but I do want to just call out a couple of the key ideas that were motivating it. So in the first section, we talk about we the people have compelling sovereign interests, right? I'm just going to pause there. The reason why we said compelling sovereign interests, as opposed to, you may have heard the term compelling governmental interests, is because there is a difference between the sovereign people and any governmental entity that may claim to represent them, because there can sometimes be a divergence between the people's interests and the government that has emerged. And so we just wanted to analytically make the distinction that these are compelling interests that belong to Americans, not to any particular governmental institution, but to us. And those interests include the freedom of speech, representative self-government, federalism, right? The idea that one size doesn't fit all and different states may have different priorities, the integrity of the electoral process, and the political equality of natural persons. So those are included just to give you a sense of the types of things that may motivate lawmakers to decide A, B, C, or D with respect to money in politics. We're not saying what they should decide, but these might be some of the things that they have in their mind as they think about it. Section 2 is really the operative part of the amendment, where it says nothing in this Constitution shall be construed to forbid Congress or the states within their respective jurisdictions from reasonably regulating blah, 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 blah. And the idea there is, and I'm sure I'll probably get input about how we can make this even clearer, but the idea there is to say courts take a back seat, defer to the reasonable policy judgments of the states and Congress. Now, let me pause here and say, like, I'm somebody who grew up thinking, of course the Supreme Court is the only one that says what the First Amendment means, or what this, like, we are all steeped in this idea of judicial supremacy. But there's a lot of really interesting scholarship, and I'll just name drop Judd Campbell at Stanford, who has looked at the original meaning of the First Amendment. And I think a couple things stand out. One, the founders never imagined that the courts would be as aggressively policing what the freedom of speech is allowed to mean. They definitely believed that legislatures would have a role in fleshing out that meaning, which is a very different way of thinking about the First Amendment than we have today. So this would allow lawmakers to be able to say, you know what, we think there's a difference between the freedom of speech and the freedom to spend. And maybe in the interests of the freedom of speech of our constituents who feel completely drowned out by outside influences, maybe we want to stem those so that our constituents can be prioritized. They should at least be able to consider that. And then the last section is just saying Congress and the states have the power to do this, and in particular gives them the choice, but doesn't require them to draw distinctions between actual human beings and artificial entities such as unions, corporations, other entities. Okay, so I know this is a lot, but I want to bring it back to what is the whole point of all this? The whole point is that with this sort of an amendment, it at least puts back on the table different tools that policymakers could use to try to strengthen the relationship and prioritize the relationship between actual constituents and their representatives. So that's the whole point. That's what's motivating it. Okay. I'll wrap up quickly. So just a refresher, how do we amend the Constitution? So there's the proposal and there's the ratification. And each of those has two methods. For our particular strategy is what we call proposal by Congress, right? Proposal by 2/3 of each chamber. And that's actually the only way that any amendments have been proposed so far. A proposal by convention has not occurred yet, so there are just a lot of open questions even about the procedure. So we believe that proposal by Congress is just pragmatically more likely to be possible, recognizing that that's a heavy lift too. And then in terms of ratification, all but one amendment was ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the states, so in that case it would be 38 states. Now I'm going to just say a little bit about like kind of the on the ground work, just to give you a picture, because I will say amendment level mobilization is just a different beast than normal movement stuff. So for us, we think about, is a member of Congress ready to propose, and is a state ready to ratify? And basically, we consider a state ready to ratify if either their state legislature has adopted a resolution. It's basically a postcard to Congress where they say, hey, we think this is a good idea, propose an amendment so we can ratify it. Or if the state's voters have basically done the same thing through a ballot initiative. And the reason why we have done work to get states ready to ratify or to pre-ratify is because history teaches that most amendments that are successful are ratified within 2 years, roughly, of proposal. And if you haven't actually done the work to make states aware and build support, then it's going to peter out. So that's why a lot of the work is happening in the states. Okay, so I'm going to close on, is this even possible? Because listen, if there's one thing I know about law students, and definitely law professors, is you're all skeptics. So first thing is that, like, we've done polling a couple years, and it's basically always hovering at around 75, 78% of Americans say that they support this idea in concept. And so what that means is that when you're out just talking to people, right? I mean, we have volunteers going to county fairs, and I mean, it's pretty amazing, but you talk to somebody wearing a Trump hat, talk to somebody wearing a Kamala hat, they're like, yes, we think this is a good idea. So we don't have to change hearts and minds about the idea. We actually, in 2023, asked this question in Oklahoma, would you support a constitutional amendment that would give the choice of regulating money in politics? And you can see here, it's very little difference between Republicans, Democrats, and independents, and it's all above like 75% support for the idea. And I'll just say that so far, 22 states actually have passed resolutions calling on Congress for this, and we've got 11 or 12 more states that are probably going to be considering resolutions this year. And what's interesting is that let me just say this about my organization, our volunteers. We have on staff Trump voters, Kamala voters, and everything in between. And the same is true of our volunteers. And I will say it's pretty rare, actually, that you have that experience. But the reason why we can kind of hold it together, even though people disagree on so many other things, is that for them, this feels like it goes to this basic question of who does our government work for? And so when we're doing work out in the states, like you will have strange bedfellows, right, who are supportive of this because they believe, for different reasons, and maybe motivated by different underlying policy preferences, but they believe that the system today is interfering with their ability to have their constituents prioritized. So listen, I'm not going to say it's going to be easy. It's not easy. But is it worth it to consider? Yes. So the final thing that I will say is just going back to popular sovereignty. The founders also believed that the amendment process was itself another way to make sure that the people remained sovereign, because they knew that either there would be flaws in the system that was built that needed to be corrected, or one of the ways they used the amendment process early on was to clarify or course correct a Supreme Court decision. So they anticipated that. And we actually get to decide whether and how to regulate money in politics. And we can do it through an amendment like this. So I want to allow everybody else to make some remarks, but thanks so much for bearing with me. Who wants to go first?
So I'll make a few remarks then. 5 minutes or so?
Sure.
Okay, that sometimes stretches out to 55, but I'll try to. So I think that the problem that you're addressing, that this amendment is meant to address, proposed amendment, proposed draft amendment, is that? It's a very important problem, and it doesn't surprise me that you're getting the response from people when you sort of ask in surveys, do you support this? Because when the First Amendment is supposed to, in not quite the words of Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., but a paraphrasing of him, provide for a free market of ideas. But the problem is when the free market of ideas kind of meets the free market of money, there can be a distortion of democracy. Certain speakers can have vastly more influence than other speakers, despite the fact that there's this idea that the citizens were equal. That, you know, our votes certainly don't depend in our system on how much we make. So why should our influence over democracy in other ways? So I think it's a significant problem you're talking about. And I think it's great that you're sort of putting this front and center, and it doesn't surprise me there's support for it. So I think it'll be helpful, though, if I play devil's advocate and maybe explain along the way why I'm not sure devils is the right word. I might actually agree with some of the questions I'm raising. He's a skeptic's advocate. So one question is just that the phrase at the core of the amendment, spending in with campaigns, elections, ballot measures, it's very broad. And I think one of the possible reasons for the positive response is people are filling it in, or they're not filling it too carefully, but to the extent they start to fill in that outline with a very positive picture, right? So, you know, if you propose to me, are you in favor of a measure that will redesign our government so that more people can participate and have their voice heard? I'd say that sounds very good, but then the question is, what does that mean? And so, you know, let me give you some examples of where I think that would be problematic, interpretations of spending in campaigns. Or one thing that might not be problematic, that might work, although the Supreme Court has not been receptive to it in recent years, is a very narrow definition that defines that the way that, say, BICRA, the Bipartisan Campaign Finance Reform Act, defined electioneering communication, which is speech within a narrow window of time, 30 days, 60 days before an election, about a candidate, and say that kind of speech can be limited to a greater extent. So the normal rules about regulating speech on the basis of its content, which generally forbid the government from doing that, would be at least loosened. But there's all kinds of other speech that influences how people think in the lead up to elections and other decisions, right? There are lots of discussions not naming the candidate, right? Imagine some of the ads that were run in the 2024 election, just run but with no candidate referenced. You know, imagine an ad that just said, you know, don't you agree, the border's a mess, it's terrible, things have to change, right? And then, you know, you could have the next day Donald Trump, then candidate Trump, go out and actually speak in similar language. Would your amendment give Congress the right to regulate speech like that, even though it doesn't mention a candidate, doesn't technically take sides? If it does, I think the problem is I'm not sure what the limiting principle is. There's just all kinds of speech about all kinds of things. Most political speech in a window before an election. Also, you know, increasingly, political scientists are saying now elections are basically starting as soon as the previous election ends. So that window is a very broad one. But if this would allow Congress and state legislatures much more freedom than strict scrutiny allows them to regulate all political speech before, you know, no matter how far it is before an election, it's kind of repealing a good deal of the First Amendment. So, you know, what's going to give it specificity, right? In other cases, you have convention remarks, you have the equivalent of constitutional legislative history. But without that narrowing, I mean, I think one concern is I like many aspects of modern First Amendment law, even though maybe it is not in line with what a good deal of the framing generation thought. But then again, right, when modern First Amendment law really began developing in 1919, the Supreme Court was finding that it was constitutional to throw people in jail for criticizing World War I. Mm-hmm. So you know, it's not clear how much we want to rewind. So that's just one set of remarks. One other very quick remark is that I think at the root of the problem you're talking about, it's more than money. So here's another variant of it, right? It might make a big difference who gets invited to be a guest on Joe Rogan's show. Now, that's not a campaign finance issue, is it? I mean, I suppose, right, Joe Rogan and Spotify, that's what's hosting him, right? Mm-hmm. They've made financial decisions to make that come about. But once that's set up, he's got a very big megaphone. And so I don't think maybe this is a virtue of the amendment, maybe it's not. Your amendment's not broad enough to cover that, is it? I mean, I don't think it should be, because I think it can't be the case that just because certain people who have an internet megaphone have a larger megaphone that they don't get to speak. So it's, I think part of the problem is that although equality is an ideal, we start to drift away from it very quickly. And so although the situation we're in isn't ideal, I can sort of see why the Supreme Court feels it can't be the First Amendment making room for massive regulation of speech that allows the answer. I'll stop here. I haven't gone to 55 minutes, but I've gone longer than I intended to. So.
Thank you.
You want me to go?
Yeah, sure. If you would.
Okay, so so I think Brian's done a great job making the argument about who should decide. I totally agree that these issues should be decided by the political branches, and that the court should step in only in the case of an obviously unconstitutional legislative enactment. I would go much farther than you. I think money in politics is absolutely toxic, and that it needs to be regulated. So I hope that something, that we can find some way to regulate it, such that the 75% of the people in the country who agree with you feel like there's some way that the political culture can respond to their instincts about how we should run elections. So, but then I think it's really impressive all the work that you've done. I think the idea of the amendment is laudable. I think one thing that I thought was really telling was your map of who's passed pre-ratification, even though, right, you've got people with Trump hats and people with Kamala Harris hats working for your organization. The map is a blue map. The red states have not passed this. Only the blue states and maybe some purple states have passed it. And here's the thing. Your organization talks, and you're very lucid, but money screams. And increasingly money lies. And our wonderful First Amendment protects the right of persons to lie in the service of political expediency. So I'm here to, like Mark says, if this passes, there goes our First Amendment. I'm like, yay, get rid of the thing. It's a mess. There are so many better models out there for how to regulate speech. Europe, Latin America, other countries, they have limits on political campaigns. And you know what? The heavens do not darken. It's possible to do it. Mark has done a great job Professor Blitz has done a great job of laying out the tough cases and the slippery slope that we might go down. But guess what? There could be a role of courts, or if the administrative state survives, something like the Federal Election Commission to decide the borderline cases. This is campaign spending. This is just general political speech. Can't regulate that. It falls outside of the amendment. I just want to say there are other ways to do this, right? So the whole thing, going back to Buckley-Vallejo, is just a dumb mistake. Money is not speech. Money is speech adjacent. Money is a volume knob, right? You can turn down a volume knob. It's content neutral, it's viewpoint neutral. Money screams. Screaming is noise pollution. Let's just regulate noise pollution, right? We could go a different route. We could also go a different route if we followed the model of Jamal Green, and you're thinking, wait, the Jamal Green who's coming here to deliver the Quinlan lecture?
Oh, nice.
Yes, that in April, that Jamal Green who would get rid of the rights absolutism that means, oh, this is speech, so you can't regulate it at all, and do more rights mediation where you would consider other things like the health of our democracy. And then Brian also mentioned Judd Campbell, and I know you're thinking, wait, the Judd Campbell who's going to deliver the Quinlan lecture here in 2026? Oh. Those of you who are three-year-olds are like, maybe I shouldn't graduate. But the crucial point that Judge Campbell makes, right, is that the framers didn't think of natural rights as absolute rights. They thought of natural rights as things that are subject to regulation in the interests of the common good. And so if we would infuse our jurisprudence with Jamal Green-style rights mediation and Judd Campbell's understanding of how you can regulate even, constitutionally protected rights, I think we get to the same place. I know that just as to hope that courts would self-reform might be just as impractical as the amendment idea, but I'm just saying there are other ways to get there.
All right, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
My turn. All right. I think this is actually going to be, it's going to work pretty well in that I'm going to talk about the subject a little bit differently than my colleagues I have since they've done the common law part of it. If you guys want me to do the common law part of it later, or at least the way in, and I will. But I'm going to actually put on a different hat as I talk about this subject. First of all, I want to say how much I sympathize with the idea of reinstating the idea of popular sovereignty. As you said in your article, which is a great piece, our muscles have atrophied in terms of our ability to govern ourselves, and it's past time for us as a people to take control of our government. But there are lots of different ways of doing that. But the amendment process, I think, is one of them, and I think it's something that we ought to consider. And it's interesting, as you were giving your talk, while we've never done it through the state convention method, a couple of the amendments, right, were really, Congress only did them because, right, they knew the state convention number was going to be met.
Yep.
So it's not like that hasn't worked. Even though they haven't formally used it. So that's something at least to think about. Because if you got 38 to ratify, you might be able to get 38
Right.
to say we should have a convention. And that's worked in the past, actually, just to use the pressure. I don't think there's any doubt, and I think both my colleagues have weighed on this, that there is no original justification for First Amendment doctrine, because the First Amendment was a jurisdictional amendment. It basically meant to take the federal government out of speech, right? So everything, right, in terms of First Amendment doctrine is not originalist, right? It just because the First Amendment after incorporation just doesn't fit, right, what the framers were meant to do. And I don't think Campbell is challenging that at all. I think what Campbell is doing, as Jeremy just said, is that what he's basically saying is that if you're going to go back and think about rights, right, you've got to think about rights the way the framers thought about it. But I don't think that means that that the framers were thinking about natural versus positive rights, the First Amendment. I don't think they were thinking about that at all. I think they were thinking the states will work that out. But I think what Campbell is saying, that if you want to actually revisit the idea and say the First Amendment basically in some way is a question of first impression, then we should revisit the way we think about rights. And I think that's a really good argument. But it doesn't it doesn't change the fact, right, that First Amendment doctrine can't be originalist, right, because it's doing something it wasn't meant to do, right? So at the end of the day, what that means is this First Amendment doctrine, which is really, remember, a 20th century artifact, right? That's when it really started, is consequentialist in nature. It's common law reasoning, right? It is judicial policy making, and has been from day one. By the court. That is the way they've always dealt with it, and that's the way I think we should think about it, because that's what they're doing, and I really think that's the end of the day what you're saying, is that it's policy making, and the court should be doing the policy making, and I think that's the way I'm going to look at it. But I'm not going to look at it from a constitutional law perspective. I'm going to put on the hat I almost never put on in this building. I'm going to look at it from someone who's been involved in the public policy process, and I'm going to look at it from my perspective. When I've been involved in public policy, I have worked on the conservative political side. So I'm going to look at this from both a policy perspective and from my preferences politically, which again I almost never do. Don't ask me to do this when I'm in class. I'm not going to do that. Although I'm always happy to talk to you about it. So what I'm going to basically deal with, or at least try to address the issue, is this good policy? Is this the way I think the world should work politically? Is this amendment going to end up leading to better outcomes? Basically, what Jeremy approach was too, only I would take exactly the opposite approach and think that actually the world that we have is a good world, and we should continue to have it. Okay. All right. First of all, I don't think our general system is really a problem. I think we'd be better off if the court overruled Buckley and actually allowed unlimited contributions and actually went the other way. Oh, by the way, the quote that he got from the task force, I was on that task force.
That's why I included the quote.
Right. So I was on the campaign finance, and overwhelmingly, right, we think campaign spending is good, and we should have more of it. At least that was the general thrust, and that generally, I think campaign finance money, right, does make democracy robust, and does make for better debates. And let me try to make that case for you. Now, first of all, the first thing I want to talk about is that you get a lot of figures, right? A lot of money, a lot of scare figures about how much we're spending on campaigns, right? 2020, the number was, the scare figure, and the right figure was $14.5 billion. Probably going to be about the same, right? Actually, it's maybe a little less this time around, whatever we're going to say.
So adjusted for inflation, 2024 was slightly lower, but in absolute terms, it was higher than 2020.
Okay, so $14.5 billion, right, in 2020. That sounds a lot, okay? $14.5 billion this is for the congressional and presidential campaigns in 2020. So you're with me, right?
Is that billion with a B?
Yes, $14.5 billion.
That's
that
a lot.
Sounds like a lot,
It's
right?
a lot.
Okay, all right. $23 billion was bet on the Super Bowl last year. $23 million was bet by Americans on one day. The Super Bowl, right? It is $8 million of 30-second ad for the Super Bowl for next week. $8 million for one ad. Okay? It's going to bring in $700 million in one day in advertising. $23 billion for the betting. Did I mention that to you? Coca-Cola spends $4 billion a year on ads for Coke. Pepsi does another $2 billion. Progressive Insurance spends almost $2 billion a year of ads, just that one company, and they're really annoying. Okay, I don't want to see Pat Mahomes in a commercial for the rest of my life. Right? I don't mind seeing him on the field. I kind of am annoyed with him too because he's also been there for too long. Right? But State Farm spends over $1 billion a year on Pat Mahomes. Okay, so that's just $3 billion for two insurance companies. Okay. The perspective, right, is different now, isn't it? We actually don't spend that much money on politics compared to what we spend on betting on the Super Bowl, right? So keep that in mind. Everyone wants to make you think we're spending a lot. We don't, okay? We spend way too much money on beer commercials, right? Which one do you think is more important, right? Betting on the Super Bowl or articulating our ideas in politics? Okay. Why do we need, right, all this campaign spending? Why do we need to have, right, all these people involved in our process putting money into all these commercials? Well, because, right, we need to balance out two things, right? The massive power of incumbency, the massive power incumbents have, right? Simply being in the news, as much as they would be, the resources, right, what they can do to send, just simple mail or messages to their constituents, right? In order to beat incumbents, equality, as they do in other countries, ain't going to be enough, right? You need more if you want to dislodge incumbents from their position, right? So we require lots and lots of money to be able to do that. Okay, the other massive set of power in our society, it's not just, like I said, the resources of incumbents. It is the power of the media, right? How, and again, I'm going to tell you this perspective from my experience in politics, right? if you guys read our daily newspaper, the Oklahoman, they don't like Ryan Walters. They haven't liked him since the day he was inaugurated. They write, and this is our school superintendent of public instruction, who's a very controversial figure. They write negative stories about him every single day, right? More than one. It's been 2 years, and every single day, right? They write no positive story, just negative story. It's every single day. They don't like him, right? Now, they own the newspaper. Oh, it's USA Today, by the way, who owns that paper. Do you understand that? So this is a national media conglomerate that has a decidedly progressive point of view. And so they decided, right, that it's going to be fun to take this guy out, right? Now, I have no brief for him, right? That's not the way I'm talking about. But I'm saying, how much money is it going to take for him to win that election? Next time around, after 4 years, right? Negative stories around every single, how much money is that worth, right, for Ryan Walters' opponents, whoever they're going to be? Right? They've had 4 years of daily commercials that they don't have to pay for, right? And so if you're on my side of the aisle, that's what we deal with at the national level, right? How do we outweigh, right, the power of the New York Times? How do we weigh the power of the Washington Post? How do we weigh that power, right, of control of Hollywood, right, and the media and universities? How do we do it? We raise money. What we used to say back in the day is that they've had their say for 4 years, but Carl Worth is going to have 2 months, right, of campaign commercials to outweigh it, what we call the air war. From September 1, we have our say, right? From September 1 to November 5th, we're going to be on the air every single day, and we're going to outweigh 4 years of the other side having their say. But we get 2 months of commercials to do it. Right, and lots of times it worked, right? But it takes a lot of money, right, to have you say when the other side has so much institutional power that they don't have to pay for. Trump is sui generis, right? He was able to do it because of the power of celebrity. He didn't actually need the money, right? Other Republican candidates didn't have that. They didn't have the fact they were so colorful that CNN would just cover them anyway, right? Because they got ratings out of it. But the rest of us, right, in order to compete, actually had to raise money, right, in order to get our message out against the power that the other side already started with. And that's just reality, right, of how things work in this country, okay? And so that's what we deal with, right? So does that mean, right, that things are working better, okay? Work they need to. What I'm saying is that generally what the Supreme Court has done is good enough, right? Good enough. It's not perfect, but it's good enough to establish conditions for competitive politics in this country, right? I would prefer that we didn't do through independent expenditures. I would prefer if we didn't have the problems with dark money. I would prefer that the debate in campaign commercials and in campaigns were done by the candidates, right? And rather than independent groups. And the Supreme Court, again, can fix that by Gregory Buckley, but we're okay, right? I think there's enough free speech out there so that we can actually have real communication. But I would say that, of course, we have problems. I don't like the idea of these independent groups, right? This is what we call dark money. Is that you have these, these really vicious commercials by these shadowy groups, and we don't know, right, who actually put the money in for these commercials. That doesn't have to happen, right? One of the things we said in the task force is that one of the biggest problems is that there's not enough regulation, right, in where the Supreme Court said that you could have disclosure, right? Here in Oklahoma, our regulation of these dark money groups are so lax, they didn't even have to give the an address or a phone number that works, right, for us to find out even who the organization is and where they're coming from. We can fix that. Right, we can actually have real federalism in regulating, right, this dark money groups. We haven't done what we can, right? Because I do think we need to have more transparency. I think they should be able to spend the money they want to spend, right? But we should know who they are, so that the candidates can say, look who's funding this group. Right? There's a reason they're running these commercials against me. Look who's funding them. We could do that, and we haven't. What we can also do, and which is what the task force also recommended, is that we can increase the amount that you can contribute, right? Raise the contribution levels for candidates, so the candidates themselves will have the resources to be able to fight against these groups. And that's something, again, we can have federalism. States, almost a dozen states have lifted, right, contribution limits so that candidates themselves can run the commercials instead of having, right, to get super PACs and independent groups, again, which ought to lead to the dark money problem to do this for them. But the whole point, right, but at the end of the day, right, why I prefer the Supreme Court's, right, set of rules and prefer to have the Supreme Court set the rules the way that they have, even though, again, we could have some improvements on it, is that if we go into the world, right, under the amendment, where we allow state legislatures to regulate, you're going to have the proverbial fox guarding the hen house, right? You're going to have the very people, right, who have the power, right, who have the incentive, right, to try to strangle speech, be in charge of the rules, right? They're going to be the beneficiaries, right? And how do you think they're going to craft the rules? They're going to craft them in ways, right, that benefit themselves. Do you think a state legislature would pass term limits? There's a reason why term limits were only passed in states that have direct democracy, okay? Because state legislatures are not going to pass laws, right, that don't benefit themselves. Same thing is going to happen with regard to campaign finance. The same thing they do with how they regulate elections and third parties, right? They're going to rig the rules in their favor. The great thing about the Supreme Court's jurisprudence is the Supreme Court understands that the check on elected officials, the most powerful check that we have, right, is unlimited political speech. Right? That is the best check we have. That is the consequentialist policy principle behind the Supreme Court's jurisprudence, and they are right about that core principle. You cannot let the elected officials be in charge of this because they will rig the rules of the game, right? And I would just say one thing, right? This idea that this era, right, of unlimited money since Buckley, right, hasn't changed our politics and hasn't had positive effects, that is absolutely not true. Right, since Buckley and the increase of money, no doubt about it. Right, I think you have a lot of things in American politics that wouldn't have happened. I think, for example, you wouldn't have had the Obama campaigns. Right, Bernie Sanders wouldn't have gotten as close as he would have. Trump, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your point of view, right? But you had insurgencies, right? That wouldn't have happened without President Obama's, when he learned how to raise money over the internet, right? He wasn't supposed to win that nomination, right? You understand that the establishment wanted Clinton. Right, and he won it right through his own organization, right, through raising lots and lots and lots of money, right, and defeated the establishment, right, and none of that would have happened. The Republicans never would have won the Congress in 1994 without campaign finance. That's how they were able to defeat the decades-long, right, power over the House. And I think a lot of the people who are campaign finance critics, as President Tillman pointed out, or people don't like the fact that that happened, and would rather live in a world where they would have continued to control everything. Okay? These things, the Republicans taking over the majority of state legislatures, no one ever thought that would happen. None of that would have happened, right, without the money fueling, right, those efforts through state after state after state, right? None of that would have happened. The New York Times had it, and New York Washington Post had their way. Right, so it's the money that it has led to that competition. It is the money that has led to the ability to challenge that establishment, and we are better than other countries. Right, and how robust our politics are. Are our politics nasty? Right, are these commercials disingenuous? Right, absolutely. You have to listen to them every single day, right? When we're watching the World Series, right? You watch all those commercials from both sides coming out, and they're nasty and they're lies, and there's no doubt about it. But that's precisely right what the political debate sounds like when it's robust and it's open, right? And it does what it's supposed to do, right? Which is give people an actual debate. All right.
All right. That was great, and I want to get to some questions, but if I may, I just wanted to respond to a couple things that I think I heard. First, I think I heard all three of you agree at a high level that the modern Supreme Court's First Amendment jurisprudence is not originalist. I think I heard Professor Spiropoulos say that it's consequentialist judicial policymaking in the mode of common law. Is that right? Okay. I think, you would also agree that the First Amendment doctrine now is not originalist?
Yeah, but if in the 52nd minute, I was going to mention some contrary considerations.
Okay, do you want to,
Well, I mean, the only thing I'll say now, I'll try to make it very quick, is just that I think one could argue that when you're without very precise guidance from the history of the framing, from the words or the history of the framing, principles can still provide guidance. And I think one can argue that, for example, this is sort of picking up on some of the things that Professor Spiropoulos was mentioning towards the end. If you think that the people should be making policy determinations, freely making proposals during debate, and then representatives responding and not have the arrow reversed, right, then certain types of government control over speech is problematic against the background of that principle. Is that an originalist argument? I don't know, but one can argue it's drawing on principles that did underlie what the framers were trying to do. Stop there.
okay, no, that's helpful. So I'm going to go back again to this who decides question, because I just want to make a point. So I think you heard three very smart people arguing about like what might be good, what policy might produce good outcomes, what policy might produce unintended consequences. And I hope what you took from that is that they are just as capable of having that discussion as the 9 unelected members of the Supreme Court. And they are invoking and reasoning from principles that are not in the Constitution themselves. They are doing something that is not a judicial function. They're doing something that is a policy function. And that's the whole point of this amendment, is to say the judges are not construing the original meaning of a text. They're not acting as interpreters of a law. They are reasoning consequentially. And I think we could put that set of decision-making back with the political branches, but I just want to say a couple of things about that. I think we all have this sense that we need the court somehow to protect us from ourselves. But I think, and this is a point that James Bradley Thayer makes in an old article, I think there's actually a risk to popular sovereignty when you become acclimatized to this system of, oh, all the hardest decisions are actually going to be solved by them, because it means we bow out and we let our policymakers off the hook. So instead of expecting people in your state legislature to have that kind of a policy discussion, to say, well, what are the pros of unlimited contributions? And I just want to emphasize, I feel like you think I want to limit money in politics, Professor Spiropoulos. For all you know, I personally would also love unlimited contributions with perfect timely disclosure. So you know, like maybe I say, I don't care how much you give to a candidate, I just want to know who's giving it. And I would like to have less importance on independent expenditures and super PACs and more directly from the candidate. He doesn't know. Maybe that's how I feel. But anyway, you can have those arguments about what policy would be good, but like, let's just not pretend that those are legal. They're policy. And if a state legislature passes a boneheaded law and it produces unintended consequences, the fix is a normal legislative process. And you have to get people to go to, their state capital and say, this sucks, change it, or we'll boot you out. But I think that's better than what happens now, which is just hoping that the Supreme Court gives us a rule we want. And the last thing I'll say about this question of who decides is that right now, we are all living in an experiment run exclusively by a body of 9 people, and nobody can try any other experiments. So the only reality we know is the reality that is produced by a system of unregulated money. So we simply do not know what would happen if, for example, Texas said, you know what, we actually just want less non-Texas money coming in. So we're going to tweak a few things. Let's see what happens. We don't know. We don't know what would happen. And maybe it would be terrible, but maybe it wouldn't. Maybe the people of Texas would like it, and maybe they'd hate it. But we're not even allowed. They're not even allowed to try. That was one of the points I wanted to make. The other one was a rhetorical thing that I just want to point out. People are a little slippery because you'll hear people start saying, limit political speech, limit political speech, limit political speech. You are limiting money. And there is a conceptual difference. If I say to Professor Blitz, you can only give $500, I'm limiting his money, but I'm not preventing him from going around and talking to people. Like, I'm not actually limiting his political speech or saying you can't say this or that. And the reason why this conceptual distinction is important is because the vast majority of Americans don't even have $400 of discretionary money to spend on gifts for their kids. So when you talk about whose political speech is being affected, it's people who have thousands and millions of dollars to deploy. And it's not their speech, it's their money, because the money that they put into the system isn't just producing speech, it's buying consultants, it's purchasing all sorts of other things in the system other than just commercials. So that's one point. And the last point, I just want to give a real sense of the stakes of this question of who decides. So in the state of Maine, Maine has ballot initiatives, and one of the questions that was going to be put to the voters had to do with whether a power pipeline could be constructed between Canada, basically built through Maine to serve power to other parts of New England. And there were huge corporate interests involved and had a stake in the outcome of this, including two companies, one of which is wholly owned by the city of Calgary, 100% owned by the city of Calgary, and another one which I think is 80% owned by a Spanish corporation, and then there are some sovereign nations that have ownership stakes in it as well. The reason these facts are important is because these entities, first of all, they're corporate entities, and they're foreign corporate entities that spent over $100 million in Maine's elections to try to influence the outcome of those ballot initiatives. And the people of Maine were so incensed by this foreign money coming into their system that they passed a law to prevent it. That law was passed by Mainers. 86%, it was a record-breaking outcome. 86% of Mainers said, we don't want this foreign money in our ballot elections. So the law was going to prevent it, and within a month of the law being passed, it was enjoined from going into effect by a federal district court. Why? Because it's a violation of the First Amendment. Now, you may agree as a policy matter that money should be able to come in. But there is no way you can tell me that a judge looking at the text, quote, the freedom of speech, that they can get from that to we now have to have a judicially imposed rule that Mainers have to let $100 million of money from a foreign-owned corporation into their elections. It's just, let's not pretend this is the judicial function. So let's put the question back where it should belong, with the people and their policymakers. So I would love to hear questions. One last quick thing to Professor Tillman's point about blue states. One of the reasons, that's true with the exception of Montana and West Virginia, a lot of the early movers were blue states when Democrats were losing the big money, and they were and it was a partisan thing. They were we don't like this, we're up in arms. Now Democrats have gotten amazing at playing this game as well. And 2 weeks ago, the Utah Republican Senate Majority Leader filed a resolution in his state invoking concerns of federalism. The week after that, in Wyoming, Republican senator with 32 co-sponsors filed this resolution for a constitutional amendment, again invoking federalism, saying we want Wyoming elections to be the product of Wyoming money and Wyoming people and not outsiders, because they saw a ton of dark money in their primaries last year. So they're coming online now because people realize like this game can be played tit for tat and it sucks for constituents. So with that, I would love to just get questions from the audience. Gareth.
Yes. So I want to kind of going back to the money's a volume knob. How loud are they screaming at you right now? Do they like ignore you? Are they interested? Do they care? I mean, Professor Sprockles made a point that like maybe you're giving them exactly what they want. You're giving the people who are getting all of this money the opportunity to regulate themselves. So are they interested in what you're doing? Do they care? Or do you think they're going to care soon once you have enough states?
That's a great question, because it's actually a balance. So we are hoping for proposal by Congress of language similar to this, which is different from sort of purely Democrat-led versions in the past, right? So this language was the product of input from a lot of conservatives, and we would like Congress to introduce something like that. I think once that happens, it triggers exactly what you're talking about, right? Because then they start to get worried that actually maybe this can happen, and it's not just like a thought experiment.
Can I play out a scenario for you? So I think I think money is not paying attention to you right now. And when money does pay attention to you, it will crush you. And here's how it will do it. It has to get through Congress, right? So right now, Pete Hegseth is the head of the Department of Defense, right? Why is that? Because he's like the most qualified for the job? Obviously not. Because there were even 3 senators who would have put him on their list of the top 50 candidates for the job? Obviously not, right? It's because money spoke to senators, Republican senators, and said, if you vote against this, I will primary you, and I will throw $100 million in against you, so vote the way I say. And that same money is going to say to the congressman, just enough congressmen so that this will never pass, and it'll only have to sway a third of them. You can vote for this, but forget about it. You know, I'm going to primary you, and you'll be out of a job. And you know what amazes me about this? Like, as much as I hate money, I think I hate congressmen more. Because, right, I mean, why didn't any of those Congress people say, so primary me, I'm not important. What's important is that we have somebody qualified running our Department of Defense. That thought apparently never occurs to legislators anymore. So don't you see that as like once money starts talking? Yeah.
Listen, yes, it's definitely easy to paint that picture, and I guess call me Pollyanna, but I will just say, like, I don't bet against the American people. You know, I'm here talking to you all, but we have people and volunteers talking to their friends and neighbors all over the country, and I think that the more that happens, if there's one thing that could possibly defeat the power of money, it's the power of the American people coming together. But the problem is it actually requires that bridging, because like you saw, 75% of people agree, but we are not in the habit of talking to one another across party lines in this country. But we have to, and that's another personal reason why I'm so committed to this, is because it's the one thing that I have found that actually can bring people together, and I find that to be very healing. So,
Can I just make a quick comment?
yeah.
It's not the money, right, that will lead them to lose the primary, right? What will lead them to lose the primary is that Republican voters really like Donald Trump, right? It doesn't matter how much money is involved.
So it's
they just really like Donald Trump, right? And so that's why they will lose, right? And so the problem is that maybe the problem is with democracy, because that's what will defeat them, right? Is that they will lose the primary because the people in the primary who vote will vote against them, right? And it doesn't matter how much money. DeSantis had tons of money, right? He couldn't beat Trump. Trump didn't need to spend $10 because people love him despite whether he spends money or not.
So I disagree. There are lots of candidates that Trump backed who didn't win. But $100 million, he'll win. The candidate that $100 million backs for a Senate seat will win.
Natalie, do you want to play the role of picking people? Because I don't know how to call on folks. You know their names, I don't.
Professor Kolar has a question.
Good choice. First name professor, we could call that. But my question is so short and so specific. That language reasonably regulate in the amendment, do you just let the court right back in through the back door? Because the court says, well, yes, you can regulate, but it says reasonably. We have to interpret that. What you guys did is unreasonable. Knock it down.
Yeah, that's a question we get a lot and that we struggle with, and quite honestly, one that I hope gets discussed as Congress proposes it, because the point of putting it in there was to signal that we're in more like James Bradley Thayer, defer to the judgment of the political branches unless it's clearly beyond the bounds of what is constitutional, right? So a very highly deferential mode of judicial review. That was the point of using the word reasonably. But I've heard from other folks, including some conservative scholars in DC, who have said potentially getting rid of that word would actually do that more effectively. And so I think as long as we get into the record that the point is to try to get the courts to back down, right, and to do as minimal level of scrutiny as possible, then how they decide to institutionalize or textualize that, we'll see.
I mean, it just seems like you say regulate A, B, and C. That's one thing versus subject matter. When you say reasonably, I think you just invite, critique, invite judicial.
Meddling, yeah. That's a good point. Thank you.
I think we have another one right here with Ashley.
So I sort of kind of agree with both Professors Tillman and Spiropoulos, which seems impossible. So I think money will crush you, but I don't think it will happen that way. I think that they're going to spend all their money to change the public opinion, which can be done. And then your friends and followers, the people who will support this, will run away from you.
Could you say a little bit about how you think that could happen? Like what would be the, yeah.
So, ads, they're gonna have the ad with the lady from The Handmaid's Tale with the silence, gag. Oh yeah, this is gonna be mean and ugly, because the people with the money don't wanna give up their puppet. Now, they might not have complete puppet control, but they do have partial puppet control, and they're not going to give it up easily. So you should really do all the work you can before they notice you exist.
Or Professor Spiropoulos will just go on Joe Rogan and persuade everybody. That could also happen.
That doesn't cost a dime.
Sorry?
That doesn't cost a dime.
No, exactly. Well, he's going to get a publicist, a stylist. There's going to be some money involved.
Mo?
I guess my question is it really good for our electorate process in America if with every change of Congress, these regulations are going to be rolled back or changed into new regulations, and so we're completely changing the campaign finance landscape every time a new Congress comes in, and is that really, from a good policy, and is that really, you're losing any sense of parity there long term? Is that what you're concerned?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, this question of like flip-flopping policy based on who's in the legislature. So I think certainly that's a possibility, but it gets back to this question of, well, I'm sure policymakers will also raise that point when they're debating what the laws should be. But even more fundamentally, the vast majority of Americans are actually unaffected by a lot of these rules because they are simply not participating in the system with big money. And so to the extent somebody's being forced to have to adapt to a change in policy, it's largely people in organizations with resources to figure out how to follow the new law. Now, I'm not saying that would be good. I'm not saying flip-flop would be ideal. It certainly would be possible. But I don't think it affects most people.
does it in turn allow Congress to regulate state elections? It feels like almost anything dealing with money falls within Congress's power. So does it start to flip the federalism argument against you?
Certainly the intent is not that at all. And in fact, like the way that we read Article 1, Section 4, where it first says states actually get the first shot at setting rules for federal elections and then Congress can step in. The only reason why Congress has passed laws governing contributions in federal elections is because of that second part of Article 1, Section 4 saying that they can change the state's rules. But in theory, right now, I'm not saying that it would ever happen, but in theory right now, Congress could say, you know what, for purposes of federal elections, we are going to incorporate by reference whatever the state laws happen to be. So like if Oklahoma said, for state elections, these are the contribution limits, Congress could theoretically say, we will just incorporate, sort of the same way like federal law that pulls in marriage, right? The actual definition of who is married, they incorporate the state law to determine that. So they could do that with money and politics laws, and I can tell you, like, that has been something of interest to our very pro-federalism folks, because they would love nothing more than to be able to say, like, we would actually like to be able to decide how much federal candidates within our state can raise. So Congress could let them, but it would take a step by Congress.
I don't know your name, I'm sorry.
I don't know it either. Oh yeah, that's what it is. I liked Garrett's question a lot about what you think will happen when when you show up on money's radar with your amendment. And I was wondering what reaction you hope will happen and what reaction would change your mind about what you think would happen.
Wait, what reaction would change my mind about what I... Well, gosh, that's tough. So what I think is interesting is that most people, once they just start to think about it at all, quickly realize that money and speech are quite different. And I think that the nature of the attack, right, or the Handmaid's Tale or whatever, what they'll say is, this amendment is, you're trying to amend the First Amendment. You guys are anti-patriots who want to amend the First Amendment. So I think that's what the attack would sound like. But then I think you just say, you start to walk them through some examples of like, well, is absolutely unlimited spending of money just truly equal to the expression of ideas? I come from a state where we have open town meeting, where once a year you all go into a room and you argue about like what you're going to approve for the town for the following year. And guess what? There's a moderator there, and the moderator's job is to make sure that everybody who wants to talk gets a chance, but that people don't hog the mic, they don't repeat themselves, yada, 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 right? So we all know, like, that's not a violation of anybody's freedom of speech. You need some rules to get ideas out there. Now, if we had a system where actually you walk into town meeting and whoever spends the most can get like all 60 minutes or all 120 minutes, we know intuitively that's insane. That's not the freedom of speech. That's volume and domination. So I was giving the signal we need to wrap up soon, so maybe we can take one more question and then eat.
Go for it.
Professionally, I've been a reporter for a number of years, and I've covered elections from the courthouse to the White House. My question is if you impose a cap on a citizen's ability to spend in political advertising, how is that not short-circuited by the value of free earned media that you get from the press? Secondly, I would ask, are you looking at the issue from the wrong side, that is, the political spending of things, rather than maybe the checks and balances on the opposite end of the issue, and that is conflicts of interest, bribery, corruption, public integrity laws? So that would be the two questions that I would pose. Is it short-circuited by the value of a Jeff Bezos owning the Washington Post and being able to throw an election in one direction? And even if he was able to do that, would you not better approach the issue by just limiting the influence that can have ultimately on that official once they're in public office?
Thank you. Those are great questions. So I'll just take the second part first, which is that even with respect to those like after the fact anti-corruption laws, those are also being challenged and struck down as violations of the First Amendment. And disclosure, for now, the Supreme Court says some disclosure laws are okay, but there's a concerted effort to get disclosure laws struck down so that you don't know who's spending the money. And that feeds to the first point, which is that you may be right, there's that effect of the media and the Joe Rogan, but one distinction is that with like a Joe Rogan or an Oprah Winfrey or whomever, you actually know who they are, and you know, like you know it's Joe Rogan's influence, you know it's Jeff Bezos, you know it's Elon Musk. So much right now, though, of the money is dark money, untraceable, so you actually have no idea where it's coming from. And it may be called some fancy like 501c4 name, but the actual donors, we don't know. And I think policymakers should be able to do something about that if they want.
But they can't. They can't. They're just not doing it.
To a certain extent, yeah.
Okay, thank you guys so much. Thank you, professors, for taking time to do this.
Yeah.
Thank you to Brian for flying down. This was amazing. Thank you guys for coming. We have food outside, so please go get a plate before you go home. Thank you guys.